What I thought I might usefully do is to provide a bit more of a macro perspective on where we are when it comes to all matters productivity. And then perhaps towards the end, drill down from the national to the local, because there is so much good local stuff going on right now. And just to kind of fix the narrative arc of what I'll say for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to the floor for a conversation. Brace yourselves, because it will start gloomy, right? And then it'll get a bit gloomier. And then towards the end, I'll bring it back at the end, right? With a few optimistic thoughts. And I remain resolutely optimistic about UK PLC and its potential if we can only unlock and enable that potential within business and beyond, which is where I'll conclude, and then we'll get the floor for some conversation. Let me start, though, with a bit of national scene setting. Where are we coming from? And the truth is, our endowment over the last 2 decades has not been what we would wish. We are rapidly approaching 2 decades of lost productivity. So roughly speaking, the story is this. Prior to the global financial crisis, we could regularly rely on productivity growing at around 2%. And over the subsequent approaching 2 decades, we've seen a downshift in productivity growth to below 1%, averaging around 0.5% over that period. As put, that sounds rather arid, sounds rather nerdy, but the consequences of that have been felt by everyone in this country, not least in their pay packets. Because it is an iron law of economics that where productivity leads, pay follows. So that stasis in productivity for getting on for 2 decades has been accompanied, as night follows day, by a stasis in pay packets. Median inflation-adjusted pay is no better for households today than it was 2 decades ago. You have to go right back to the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, to find a similar period of stasis in pay packets. That shows up in all manner of unfortunate places, including the fact that this is the first cohort of young people since the Industrial Revolution who, in age equivalent terms, are tracking below their parents when it comes to pay. They are tracking below their grandparents when it comes to home ownership. That generational social contract of progress has been breached. And that's why it matters to everyone. And that's why it's not arid, it's very much of the moment. The average household, had we had pre-global financial crisis levels of productivity growth, would be £10,000, £15,000 per year better off. That's what we have forgone as a country as a result of that downshift in productivity. We see it at the spatial, at the geographic level, the persisting gap in productivity levels between, say, here in Sheffield and the southeast of England. That's a gap of perhaps 20 or 30%. We see it in productivity gaps at the global level. We have a productivity gap with, say, France and Germany of 15 and 20%. We have a productivity gap with the US of 20 or 30%. We've seen a downshift in the productivity of pretty much every sector in the UK. And the consequence of that is that the long tail of businesses for whom productivity has stood still in the UK over the past 2 decades has grown to around 2/3. Around 2/3 of British business have experienced effectively no productivity rises over the past 20 years or so, mirroring the pattern among households. So far then, so bad, and that begs the question, what has happened? Why the downshift? What's sometimes referred to as the productivity puzzle. Well, let me tell you, it isn't a puzzle. We are falling over ourselves with explanations for why that has happened. And at root, the single most important is that we have, on a sustained basis and systematic basis and significant basis, underinvested in the capitals that are key for productivity and growth. And from a prospectively very long list, let me highlight and talk about a little bit 4 of those capitals. 2 that economists like me bang on about all the time, which is physical capital and human capital. That's stuff and people in human speak. And then the other 2 are social capital and political capital, which are talked about a bit less by economists, but I think are a crucial ingredient of the recipe book for higher productivity and growth. So let me cover off those in turn, starting with physical capital. The roads, the rail, the reservoir, the buildings, the technology that we know underpin productivity and growth. UK PLC has fared lamentably when it comes to investing in all of those things. We have been at or towards the bottom of the G7 league table for investment in those things for 27 of the last 30 years, right? And if you systematically underinvest in those things for the better part of 30 years, what you find is a big gap opens up between how much you've invested and how much others around the world have invested. And the Productivity Institute have scaled that gap at around £2 trillion. That's the cumulative scale of underinvestment in the UK. That shows up very clearly in the geographic pattern of investment. So just across the way, across the Pennines, investment into Greater Manchester has been around 3 times investment here in Sheffield. Where I came from this morning, down in London, investment there over that same period has been 10 times what has been invested in Sheffield. A very clear, very systematic, very spatially unequal distribution of capital, physical capital, which you see all around us. The second aspect is human capital. I mentioned that the UK sat towards the bottom of the league table for investment in machines and technology and kit. Lamentably, that's also true when it comes to investment in what we all think is our most precious asset of all, that is to say, people. Both public and private investment in people, in their training, sits towards the bottom of the self-same international league table. That's why we find ourselves with around 10 million people in our workforce, approaching a third of our workforce, who do not have the skills we would wish to thrive in the world of work. With a further 3 million people who are overskilled for the job that they are doing. That is fully a third of the workforce. When it comes to technologies, AI, which I know has been much discussed this morning, the good news is that rates of adoption of AI are at this stage of the technology cycle quite reasonable, quite high in fact. More than half of businesses, according to a recent Chambers of Commerce survey, had adopted AI to some degree. The bad news is that at most businesses, that was still wafer thin when it comes to adoption. Only around 10% of businesses had fully used AI as a way of reconfiguring their business model. So one aspect of the people bit is skills. The other bit, though, is participation. how many people are actually taking part in the workforce right now? And there, the picture in some ways is even more troubling. We have now approaching 1.9 million people across the UK who are seeking work but have yet to find work, unemployment. And in the days of yore, unemployment was the problem for UK PLC. That is not the case today. The problem today is not unemployment, it's economic inactivity. People not even seeking work. We have approaching 10 million people across the UK who are economically inactive for a variety of reasons. Around a third of those, that inactivity is due to ill health of various types. Of that 9.8 million, approaching 1 million of them are aged between 16 and 24, right? Youngest generation. The largest share of which are not just not in work, but not seeking work or seeking training. 400,000 of them aren't even claiming benefits, right? Absolute black hole of participation amongst that first cohort of prospective workers. What a deadweight loss that is imposing on the UK economy, on businesses. And that, as you might know, is the subject of Alan Milburn's review for the government of how to tackle the so-called NEET problem among the youngest in society. That problem is unequally spread spatially. The poorer parts of the country tend to be those where the NEET rates among young people are highest. That's the low point, by the way. It's going to pick up from here in a second. But not quite yet, because I want to discuss the other two capitals much more briefly, social capital and political capital. What do I mean by social capital? I mean the connectivity between people. I mean the trust in society. This is often underplayed when we think about what it takes to make a place, what it takes to make a nation. But the evidence on this is now completely overwhelming. You cannot build an economy, you cannot build a society if there is an absence of connectivity between people, an absence of trust within people about that economy and about that society. There is no more potent means of boosting social mobility, which is stalled, than improved social connectivity. The evidence on this could not be clearer. It really is who you know, rather than what you know, that matters for your advancement, generation by generation. And we, as a nation, have systematically underinvested in our social infrastructure, the thing that creates that trust and social connectivity. Social housing, high streets, parks, youth clubs, community centres, the poor relation of the infrastructures relative to physical infrastructure and digital, but absolutely foundational, existential to a good economy and a good society. And the final capital, physical, human, social, was political. Now is not the time to talk about Westminster politics. Maybe during the break. But the truth is, among the reasons we have got stuck and stalled is we've failed to embolden and empower local leaders to be a master of their own destiny. We are, by some margin, the most centralized democracy on the planet. The approach to so-called devolution so far has been half a loaf, half-baked. Half-baked because even on spending powers for local leaders like the mayor here, Oliver Coppard, who I work with closely, only a fraction of those powers have thus far been conferred. Tackling that NEET challenge, how does Oliver do that when he has no power really over local schools, much less over local skills. And the half a loaf bit is that local leaders currently have no power over taxation. They can spend but cannot raise money, which is effectively trying to control a local economy with one hand tied behind your back. That's definitely the low point. It's going to pick up from here. Because despite all of that, despite that endowment, I think in many respects we could be, if we play our cards right, set fair for transformation in the UK's fortunes and the fortunes of the regions. Because peering beneath all that stuff that's gone wrong is a kernel of really good stuff that could go right. And let me mention 2 or 3 of the elements of that before we go to the floor. Firstly, and not discussed anything like enough. When I travel around the UK, as I have now for many decades, visiting businesses, visiting local people, I do that partly to cheer myself up, and partly because with no exceptions, I always come away overwhelmed from having met brilliant businesses and brilliant people doing brilliant things. Now, that could be just anecdote, but of course, data is no more than the plural of anecdote. And it turns out the data bears out that anecdote. On many metrics, we are residing in the most innovative nation on the planet. I'll give you one metric of that. I mentioned that long tail of businesses for whom productivity had stood still. I mentioned the gap to productivity in France and Germany and the US. But the very best of British business, the upper tail, not the long lower tail, sits well above our international competitors. The very best British businesses have levels of productivity 10, 20, 30% above the very best of French, German, and US businesses. We have a long lower tail, but a larger, fatter upper tail as well. There are 1,500 businesses in the UK whose revenues sit north of 25 million, right up to 500 million, who are growing like crazy right now. They aren't yet the unicorns, the £1 billion businesses, by the way, of which we've spawned almost 200 in the UK over the last decade or so. Not yet unicorns, not yet grown wings, but nonetheless are the Colts and the Thoroughbreds, coming through at real pace. The engine of our economy, driving jobs, driving growth, driving productivity. If you ranked those Colts and Thoroughbreds internationally, you'd find that the UK sits third by number in the global league table, behind only the US and China. You may have spotted, but the population of the US and China is larger than the UK. So on a per capita basis, we are top of the pops when it comes to innovative businesses growing at a rapid rate of knots, to mix and switch my metaphors, the gazelles of the business world. Why then is that not showing up in levels of measured productivity and pay and growth? Well, too many of those businesses are being lost early on. And by lost, I mean bought out by foreign competitors before they have found their wings. An absence of money problem, not a new problem. That problem first discussed by the UK government back in the 1930s. It remains a scale-up problem today. But the irony is this: the money exists. Whisper it quietly, the world is awash with money right now. And a chunk of it sits here in something called pension funds, right? They are sitting on 6 trillion, count the zeros, of assets, only the tiny slither of which, around 1 or 2%, go into British businesses. We are the only pension system on the planet that does not have a home bias towards our own businesses, right? The ultimate irony, so today I came out of King's Cross. There's probably not a better example of regeneration than the King's Cross Regeneration Project. Who fully owns King's Cross? Australian pension funds, right? Not a British pension fund in sight. Australian, Canadian, Dutch pension funds invest very much more in British businesses than British pension funds. We had a piece of good news from Westminster yesterday. Remember that at the beginning? Yesterday. And that was that the pensions bill went through in an attempt to replumb our financial system, to have more of this capital flow towards those cults and thoroughbreds on which the UK rules the waves. We have the money here, we have the businesses here. If we can plumb one to the other, we could get liftoff. We ought to get liftoff when it comes to productivity, pay, and growth. With one more ingredient, and that ingredient is governance. Because the way to unlock all of that latent talent locally is by empowering leaders locally. And on this front, just a glimmer of light was provided about a month ago by the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, a former colleague of mine, when in her May's lecture, she spoke about the possibility in the autumn of delivering a roadmap for fiscal devolution. In other words, giving local leaders the capacity to be master of their own financial destiny in future, removing the hand that was strapped behind local leaders back, moving from half a loaf to a full loaf when it comes to generating local growth. We need to go fast on all of these fronts if we are to unlock that potential. Can it be done? Is this boosterism? Is it fanciful? Is it wishful thinking? Can it be done? Well, I'll tell you, as many of you will know, not only can it be done, but it has been done, and it is being done at a place very close to where we sit today. So, 40 years ago, the miners' strike was raging. And the most visceral moment of the miners' strike was the Battle of Orgreave. After that, and after the Orgreave coal mine had closed, the University of Sheffield, where I'm proud to be the Chancellor, bought the land, quite speculative actually, and decided to set up a little research centre. I mean, a punt, right? And from that kernel has grown over time what is now that Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, where I am the chair. From that punt, from that innovation, that kernel of innovation, now sit many of the best and biggest businesses in the world. Boeing and Rolls-Royce and McLaren, the list goes on. So here's a question for the room. And the clue I may have already provided. What part of the north of England has experienced the most rapid productivity growth over the last 20 years? Is Rotherham. Who said that? Very good. The answer is Rotherham, yeah. Not Greater Manchester, not Leeds, not Newcastle, Rotherham. At the same time, we've seen, rough stasis in productivity nationally. Over that same 20-year period, productivity in Rotherham has risen by over 60%, by over 60%. A productivity miracle on any definition. And that is down to AMRC and the fruits of the AMRC. It's the reason why that Don Valley Innovation Corridor is the centrepiece of Oliver Coppard, the South Yorkshire Mayor's growth plan for the South Yorkshire region in the period ahead. It shows what is possible with innovation, with faith, with investment on a sustained basis. Because there we have, from minor strike to miracle, a story hiding in plain sight. And that takes me to my final point. Among the important things about today is the stories we tell about success. Too often right now we are talking ourselves down and not celebrating success sufficiently. From the numbers I've given you, from my visits, I know that success sits there in all four corners of UK PLC, across every sector in UK PLC. If we can tell those stories and use that as the vehicle for sustained investment in the physical, the human, the social, and the political, there's absolutely no reason why UK growth, productivity, and pay can't surpass the performance we saw prior to the global financial crisis. That is growth from the bottom up, led locally by led local businesses. And that's why events like today are so important. And with that, Jason, I think I should probably stop and collect any thoughts, questions, reflections, or criticisms from the audience. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Alex Swallow from Alex Swallow Consulting. So many questions I could ask you, but I want you just to expand perhaps a little bit on, you were talking about not the long tail, but at the high end, the real amazing companies. What I want to know is what are they doing right, or what have they been doing right? And have they been doing that in spite of the lack of support they've received? Could you expand a little bit on how that has actually happened? Thanks.
Yeah, and there's no one singular ingredient in those success stories. But let me highlight one of them, which I think is really important right now. And that's the importance of risk culture and risk appetite, right? And it speaks precisely to your point. Those successful businesses are those that are doing it despite everything, rather than stopping it because of something, right? That's the difference between asking yourself the question, what could go right, and what could go wrong. Are you peering at the upper tail of possibility or the downside tail of disaster? And the truth is, I totally get why both businesses and indeed individuals are asking themselves right now, what more could go wrong? Because a lot has gone wrong over that 20-year period, right? It hasn't been one thing. It's been one bloody thing after another. GFC, and then it's aftershock in the euro area crisis, and then Brexit. Don't mention Brexit, too late now. Then COVID, and then Russia-Ukraine, and then Liberation Day and trade, and then this year Middle East. Understandably, human nature would have everyone ducking under the duvet in that situation, hunkering down. And what distinguishes that top tail is that in the face of that, they're not looking for reasons not to do stuff. They're doing stuff despite the way of the world. They're still, they're leaning into risk rather than away from risk. And that's super important right now. Of the 10% of businesses from that survey that had fully embraced AI, meaning they'd used it to reconfigure their business model. Two striking feature about that 10%. One, they'd net created jobs off the back of it, right? Lots of fearfulness right now about AI being a job killer. The biggest job killer is not adopting AI, let me tell you. In future, there'll be two classes of businesses, those that adopt AI and those that aren't businesses anymore. So no job loss, and between a 10 and 20% boost in productivity, right? Those that have lent into that, embrace the uncertainty, emerge victorious. And that question of risk culture and risk appetite is, for me, foundational, not just to what's gone wrong in UK PLC over the last few years, but how to make it right in future.
Sally Wright, University Management School.
Hello.
A question around industry policy, if I may. It seems to me for a number of decades the UK has tried to pick some winners and to pick some sectors where they've put policy priorities in their industry policy. But maybe they've forgotten about the public sector and about the service sector where we know there are a lot of, where we have a huge percentage of employment. If you had the opportunity, how do you think we can improve productivity in the sectors that aren't the sort of chosen ones?
Yeah. Industrial policy beats no industrial policy. And for many decades, we lived without one, and we still bear the scars of that, including here in South Yorkshire, I should say, across the whole of North of England, as it turns out. So that we have one beats not having one. Actually, for UK PLC, the problem hasn't been not having an industrial strategy or policy. It's that we've had too many of them, of course. On some definitions, a dozen, perhaps more than that. And therein lies the problem, of course, that we've chopped and changed those strategies over time. If you are to have one, and I would have one, I'm pleased that we do have one, it's important to win your winners, to know where your areas of comparative strength are, and to back them at scale over the longer term. I'm all for that. But, and it's an important but, one, you must back them at scale and over the longer term, and it's not clear that this vintage of strategy thus far has done that, or its predecessor, which I was intimately involved in as chair of the Industrial Strategy Council at the time. And secondly, that must not be at the neglect of every other sector, what's sometimes called the foundational or the everyday economy, the place where most people work, that generates most of the value. And it's certainly incorrect to say that the largest productivity gains will come from the superstars. That's not clear to me at all. Let me give you a concrete example of that. Construction sector, a massive part of the economy, almost as big as manufacturing, 8-9% of the economy. The business model of much of construction is largely unchanged in a century. We build houses today roughly the same way as we did 100 years ago. And that's among the reasons we're finding it hard to build the houses we are today, the 1.5 million housing target that the government has set, that previous governments set, that everyone has systematically missed. Do I think it's possible that we could completely reconfigure the business model of construction in a way that delivered huge productivity benefits? Yes, I do. Do I think that would be a useful thing for the government to pursue with vigor and act? Yes, I do. And what's true of construction is true of the other bits of manufacturing, is true of large areas, not all, but large areas of services. So I think this agenda, the productivity lifting agenda, should not at all be distinctive to the superstars, even if we back them at scale over the longer term. That penny is yet to fully drop. In the work I did last year with Claire Ward, who's the mayor of the East Midlands, that was about building a model of growth that was as much or more about the foundational sectors as it was about the superstar sectors. And that, for me, is the key for having growth felt locally by local people in their pay packet.
Hi, Andy. Andy Green from HLM Architects. Really interested in your thoughts on how we as a society, as a region, can help build on social capital and its relevance to the Rotherham case study, please.
Sheffield, was known as the People's Republic. South Yorkshire was the People's Republic of South Yorkshire, right? With the four warring factions. Never the twain shall meet. And one of the real benefits of having strategic leadership in the form of a mayor is the ability to bring those parties together. I think that's work in progress, but unless there has been progress on that front over the course of the past few years. Do we need to accompany that with a more wholehearted, full-throated investment in what I called social infrastructure? Yes, we do. So when I visited Barnsley with Steve Houghton, a couple of summers ago, It's clear that one of the keys to success in Barnsley and Steve's model has been to invest in social infrastructure in the town centre. From NHS diagnostic centres in the city centre to the bridge over to the football ground to the reopening of the theatre and the cinema. So, you know, what I'd love to see, perhaps even as part of the government's Pride in Place initiative, is a much more active reinvestment in those things we know are hugely valued by local residents, but which hitherto have been rather overlooked, or indeed, if councils are looking for savings, often they started with those things, right? Investment in our libraries and high streets and theatres is down between 30 and 50% since 2010. And that's because they were seen as being nice to haves, seen as being the hundreds and thousands on the cake. They are the cake. If you live there, they are the cake. So I hope among the things that South Yorkshire, Sheffield can do is to demonstrate by deed that investment in those things is foundational to a good economy and to a good society for local people. And I think that penny, ever so slowly, is beginning to drop with national government as well. But ultimately, I think leadership needs to come locally rather than nationally.
Hi, Georgina Weir, HR consultant. I was going to ask about Sheffield and South Yorkshire learning from other areas, such as one of our neighbours, Leeds in West Yorkshire, Manchester, in terms of that development and growth. Do you think that we're doing enough sharing of knowledge and expertise?
I think one of the good things about local politics, as distinct from national politics, is that not always, but mostly, the mayors play nicely and cooperate as much as they compete. A bit of competition is good, by the way. A bit of FOMO is good at the local level. A bit of innovation is good. So I think there has been sharing of experience, innovation that is then replicated elsewhere, and that's a good thing. And maybe this again might be overly optimistic. I think, you know, the Greater Manchester story has now become a great story, right? A clear success story. And it's not an overnight success either. It's been built up over at least 30 years. You know, from the foundations laid by Howard Bernstein and Richard Leese onto its more recent incarnation since Andy took over. And now that has the vibe, right? And that's where, you know, it's, other than London, I think the only city that's a net importer of graduates. It's attracting money, both domestic and foreign. So are there bits of that South Yorkshire and Sheffield can learn from? Yes. Is that happening? I think yes. One of the upsides of having lagged for a bit is that the catch-up potential is enormous. And the catch-up potential both here, South Yorkshire, and Humber, and in the northeast, is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. It is latent. The latent energy there is incredible. And for the first time in my working life, probably the first time in my life actually, I am incredibly optimistic about the potential of this place and the Humber and the northeast with their strategic leadership in place and with now a pretty clear roadmap about how to get growth going, how to mobilize people, how to mobilize business, and how to mobilize money. So I think this could be the dawn of what could be a fabulous catch-up era for all three of those regions, provided we play our policy cards right in the way I mentioned a few minutes ago.
John Stammers, I actually work at the AMRC. Fiscal capital. We find that a lot of UK manufacturers aren't willing to invest in new machine tools for their companies, which could actually help with productivity and technology, because they are quite often looking for a very short-term return on investment, which is at odds with counterparts on the continent and overseas in the US.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why that might be and what we could do to help that risk-averse behaviour?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, what you say speaks to that underinvestment problem I mentioned, what feels like an eon ago, about half an hour it was, wasn't it? Which is both public and private. It's shared. It's true of the investment that government has made. It's as true of the investment that businesses have been made. And when you're looking for reasons for that, too short a payback period or too great a degree of short-termism often looms large as one of the explanations. That was among the reasons why the government started allowing full expensing of some of that stuff. That was directionally intended to bring forward investment, and that helped as long as it lasts. Ultimately, though, this goes to the question of governance and corporate governance. This requires a view of how best to accrete long-term value in the firm. It's penny wise but pound foolish not to invest in your business. Otherwise, you're just dying slowly. And ultimately, although you can nudge and nurdle from central government through tax, that is on businesses and on their corporate governance that they make those choices. Just as it's on pension funds to make their self-same choices. Right now, those pension fund trustees are choosing to invest in government securities, paying diddly squat, rather than investing in the business of tomorrow, those unicorns prospectively, that would yield a much higher return to their end beneficiaries. Self-same problem through a financial rather than through a manufacturing lens. This goes to questions of culture and risk appetite. The government can enable and perhaps even nudge, but ultimately it's on business to make that change. One of the reasons I was so keen to do the work with the British Chambers of Commerce is to have businesses act collectively to step up and make just those sorts of investment.